In 1943, the intelligence war in Europe had reached a critical turning point. The Germans believed they had rebuilt their spy networks after early setbacks. Their operatives were active across Britain, neutral countries, and occupied territories. Their analysts were confident they could predict Allied moves, but they were wrong. Catastrophically, completely, irreversibly wrong. What they didn't know was that British intelligence had achieved something unprecedented in the history of espionage. They had turned nearly every German agent in Britain. They controlled the information flowing to Berlin, and they were about to use that control to execute the most devastating psychological operation in intelligence history. The operation had no single name that history remembers clearly. Some files called it Operation Mirror. Others referred to it as the double-cross endgame. But whatever the designation, its purpose was singular and brutal, to make German intelligence lose all faith in their own capabilities. By the time it was over, the German spy network wouldn't just be defeated, it would be psychologically shattered, unable to trust any information, paralyzed by doubt at the exact moment when accurate intelligence mattered most. This is the story of how British intelligence destroyed not just German spies, but the very concept of trust within Germany's intelligence apparatus. It's a story of deception so complete that even when the truth was revealed, the Germans couldn't be certain what was real and what was false. The double-cross system. To understand what happened in 1943, you need to understand the system that made it possible. When Germany began sending spies to Britain in 1940, British intelligence faced a choice. They could arrest these agents and eliminate them, or they could do something far more valuable: turn them. MI5, Britain's domestic intelligence service, chose the second option. They created what became known as the double-cross system, managed by the 20 Committee. The name was a pun on the Roman numerals XX, which looked like a double cross. The concept was elegant. Instead of simply catching German spies, British intelligence would capture them, confront them with evidence of their mission, and give them a choice: work for Britain or face execution as spies. Most chose to work for Britain. But the double-cross system wasn't just about turning individual agents. It was about controlling the entire intelligence picture that Germany received about Britain. If you controlled all the sources feeding information to the enemy, you could manipulate their entire understanding of reality. By 1943, the system had achieved something remarkable. Nearly every German agent in Britain was working for British intelligence. The few who weren't had been identified and were under constant surveillance. Germany didn't have a single reliable source of information about what was actually happening in Britain. The turned agents sent regular reports to Germany using their original codes and communication methods. But every message was crafted by British intelligence handlers. Every piece of information was carefully designed to support whatever deception British intelligence wanted Germany to believe. The Germans had no idea. They believed their spy network in Britain was functioning. They believed the intelligence they were receiving was genuine. They made decisions based on information that British intelligence had specifically designed to mislead them. This system had already achieved significant successes. It had helped protect convoy routes. It had concealed military buildups. It had misdirected German attention away from genuine operations. But by mid-1943, British intelligence was ready to use the double-cross system for something far more ambitious and destructive. The state of German intelligence. To appreciate the psychological impact of what was about to happen, you need to understand the mindset of German intelligence in 1943. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, had experienced mixed fortunes in the war. Early successes had given way to troubling failures. Operations that should have succeeded had mysteriously failed. Intelligence that seemed reliable had proven false. Agents who seemed secure had disappeared. But German intelligence analysts had explanations for these setbacks. Espionage was difficult. Britain had competent counterintelligence. Some failures were inevitable. The important thing was that they still had an extensive network providing regular intelligence. What they didn't realize was that their entire intelligence picture was controlled by the enemy. They were like someone watching a movie and believing it was reality, unaware that every scene was scripted and directed specifically to deceive them. The leadership of the Abwehr was complex and sometimes contradictory. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, who led the organization, was himself a complicated figure whose loyalties would later be questioned. But regardless of his personal views, the Abwehr as an institution was committed to serving Germany's war effort. The analysts working within the Abwehr were professionals. They had training, experience, and systematic methods for evaluating intelligence. They cross-referenced reports from different sources. They looked for inconsistencies. They applied rigorous standards before accepting information as reliable. This professionalism made them both more effective and more vulnerable. More effective because they actually caught many deceptions and false reports. More vulnerable because their systematic approach gave them confidence in their methods. When information passed all their checks, they believed it must be genuine, and British intelligence had learned exactly how to craft information that would pass those checks. By 1943, German intelligence was in a dangerous state of false confidence. They knew the war had turned against Germany in some respects. The Eastern Front was increasingly difficult. Allied bombing was intensifying. But they believed they still had good intelligence about British and American capabilities and intentions. They were about to discover how wrong they were. Operation Mirror begins. The operation that would shatter German intelligence confidence began quietly in the spring of 1943. It didn't start with a single dramatic moment, but with a series of small, seemingly insignificant intelligence reports. German handlers began receiving information from their British-based agents about increased activity around certain military installations, training exercises involving new units, movement of supplies to unusual locations, bureaucratic communications about a classified operation. The intelligence was fragmentary, which made it seem more authentic. Real intelligence is rarely complete. Agents see pieces of a larger picture without understanding the whole. The reports coming from Britain had exactly that quality of partial visibility. Over several weeks, these fragments began to form a pattern. Something significant was being planned. A new operational headquarters had been established. Code words appeared in intercepted communications. Supply movements suggested preparations for a major operation. German analysts began trying to piece together what the Allies were planning. The intelligence suggested an operation that would involve coordination between British and American forces, possibly targeting occupied Europe, possibly later in 1943 or early 1944. But there were confusing elements. Some of the intelligence didn't quite fit. The operation seemed to be planned for one target, but other evidence suggested a different target. Unit designations didn't always match known organizational structures. German intelligence did what they were trained to do. They analyzed the inconsistencies. They developed hypotheses to explain them. The most logical explanation seemed to be that the Allies were planning a deception within their genuine operation, trying to confuse German intelligence about the exact target even while mounting a real operation. This interpretation was exactly what British intelligence wanted them to believe. It allowed the Germans to explain away inconsistencies, while still accepting the overall framework of the false intelligence. As summer approached, the intelligence reports intensified. More details emerged. The operation had a code name, though the reports disagreed about what it was. Senior officers were mentioned. Timelines were suggested. German intelligence became increasingly focused on this mysterious Allied operation. Resources were devoted to understanding it. Analysts worked long hours trying to crack the puzzle. What were the Allies really planning? The obsession was precisely what British intelligence wanted. While German analysts focused on decoding this elaborate false operation, they were paying less attention to what was actually happening. Real Allied preparations for operations in the Mediterranean and beyond proceeded with less German scrutiny. But the psychological operation had a deeper purpose than simply misdirecting attention. It was designed to destroy something more fundamental than German knowledge of a specific operation. It was designed to destroy German confidence in their entire intelligence apparatus. The trap springs. The climax of the operation came in late summer 1943. German intelligence believed they had finally assembled enough pieces to understand what the Allies were planning. They prepared a comprehensive assessment for German military leadership. According to their analysis, the Allies were planning a major operation, possibly an amphibious landing, targeting a specific location that seemed to make strategic sense. The intelligence was marked high confidence. Multiple sources had contributed. The analysis was thorough. German military leadership made decisions based on this intelligence. Forces were positioned. Defensive preparations were enhanced in the identified areas. Resources were allocated. And then British intelligence did something devastating. They began feeding information through the double agents that contradicted the previous intelligence. Not dramatically or suddenly, but gradually and confusingly. New reports suggested the operation might target a different location, or might not be amphibious after all, or might have been postponed, or might have been a cover for something else entirely. German analysts were confused but not yet alarmed. Intelligence often evolved as operations developed. They worked to incorporate the new information into their understanding, but the contradictions kept coming. Every time German intelligence thought they understood the picture, new reports would introduce elements that didn't fit. Sources that had previously agreed began reporting different information. Details that had seemed settled became uncertain. The analysts faced a choice. Either their previous assessment was wrong, or their sources were unreliable, or the Allies were executing an extremely sophisticated deception operation. They began to suspect the third option. Perhaps the Allies had discovered that German intelligence was tracking this operation and had deliberately fed false information to mislead them. It was standard practice in intelligence warfare, but that realization created a new problem. If the recent contradictory information was an Allied deception, then the original intelligence might be correct. But if the original intelligence was part of the deception, then nothing they believed was reliable. German intelligence found itself in an analytical paradox. Any framework they used to evaluate the information could be turned against itself. If they trusted sources that agreed with each other, the Allies might be feeding coordinated false information to those sources. If they looked for contradictions to identify false information, the Allies might be deliberately introducing contradictions to make them doubt genuine intelligence. They were trapped in a hall of mirrors, unable to determine what was reflection and what was real. The revelation. The psychological torture intensified when British intelligence took the final devastating step. They allowed German intelligence to discover that some of their agents in Britain had been compromised. Not all of them, not even most of them. Just enough to create catastrophic doubt. The revelation came through various channels. A double agent who had been working for Britain was deliberately exposed, allowing German intelligence to realize that at least some of their sources had been turned. Intercepted communications suggested British intelligence had more information about German operations than should be possible. As German analysts investigated, they began to uncover the horrifying scope of their compromise. The agent they'd discovered wasn't the only one. There were others, and the timeline of when these agents had been turned was deeply disturbing. Some had been compromised for months, possibly over a year, which meant that much of the intelligence German leadership had been receiving during that entire period was controlled by the enemy. But here's what made it psychologically devastating. German intelligence couldn't determine exactly which agents had been compromised and which remained loyal. The agents they'd discovered were obviously controlled by Britain. But what about the others? The ones who hadn't been exposed? British intelligence had been brilliant in how they structured the revelation. They'd exposed enough to prove that the double-cross system existed and had achieved deep penetration of German networks. But they'd left enough uncertainty that German analysts couldn't determine the full extent of the compromise. Were all their British-based agents compromised? Most of them? Half? The Germans had no way to know for certain. Every report that had come from Britain for the past year was now suspect. Every analysis based on that intelligence was potentially worthless. Every decision made by German military leadership based on that intelligence might have been exactly what the Allies wanted them to decide. The operation called Mirror had achieved its purpose. German intelligence was now looking at a reflection of themselves, unable to determine what was real and what was enemy manipulation. The psychological collapse. The impact on German intelligence wasn't just operational, it was psychological and organizational. Individual analysts who had spent months working on assessments realized their work might be completely worthless. Intelligence they had certified as high confidence might be elaborate British deception. Their professional judgment, their expertise, their careful methodology had all been rendered useless by an enemy that controlled their sources. The humiliation was profound. These were professionals who took pride in their work. They had dedicated their careers to the difficult art of separating truth from deception, and they had been completely fooled, not for days or weeks, but for months, possibly over a year. Trust within the organization collapsed. If the enemy had penetrated so deeply, could there be traitors within the Abwehr itself? Analysts began suspecting each other. Information sharing became guarded. The collaborative environment necessary for good intelligence work was poisoned by paranoia. Leadership faced impossible decisions. They couldn't simply ignore all intelligence from Britain. They needed some understanding of what the enemy was doing. But they couldn't trust that intelligence either. Every report might be deception. They tried to develop new methods for identifying compromised sources, but every method was vulnerable. If a source consistently provided information that seemed accurate, was that because the source was genuine, or because British intelligence was feeding that source a careful mixture of truth and lies to maintain credibility? If a source provided information that contradicted other sources, was that a sign the source was independent and reliable, or was it British intelligence deliberately introducing contradictions to create confusion? There was no analytical framework that couldn't be turned against itself. German intelligence became paralyzed by doubt at precisely the moment when the war was reaching critical phases. Allied preparations for major operations in 1944 were beginning. Accurate intelligence about those preparations was crucial for Germany's survival. But German intelligence couldn't trust their own assessments. Every report was filtered through layers of suspicion and second-guessing. By the time information reached decision-makers, it was hedged with so many qualifications and caveats that it was nearly useless. The Abwehr, which had once been a source of valuable intelligence for German military planning, became almost irrelevant. Leadership learned to make decisions without relying on intelligence from Britain because they simply couldn't determine what was real. The cascade of failures. The destruction of confidence in German intelligence had cascading effects across German war planning. When the Allies invaded Sicily in July 1943, German forces were less prepared than they should have been, partly because intelligence assessments about Allied intentions had been undermined by the broader crisis of confidence in sources. When planning for the defense of Western Europe intensified in late 1943 and early 1944, German commanders couldn't get reliable intelligence about Allied strength, capabilities, or intentions regarding the anticipated invasion. The famous Operation Fortitude, which deceived the Germans about the location of the D-Day landings in 1944, was built on the foundation laid by operations like Mirror. German intelligence was already so compromised and demoralized that they were vulnerable to the massive deception operation that accompanied the Normandy invasion. Even when German intelligence received accurate information, they couldn't trust it. There were instances where genuine intelligence about Allied operations reached German analysts, but they dismissed it as likely deception because they no longer trusted their sources or their own judgment. The psychological damage inflicted by the double-cross system and operations like Mirror was in some ways more devastating than physical military defeats. You can recover from a lost battle by reorganizing and fighting again, but recovering from the loss of confidence in your own capabilities is far more difficult. German intelligence never fully recovered. The Abwehr was eventually absorbed into the SS intelligence service, partly because of its failures and compromises. Individual analysts who had been involved in the catastrophic failures of 1943 carried that burden for the rest of their careers and lives. The human cost. Behind the operational success were human stories of agents caught between impossible pressures. The German agents who had been turned and forced to work for British intelligence lived in constant fear. If Germany discovered they'd been compromised, their families in occupied territory might face consequences. If they failed to satisfy their British handlers, they faced execution as spies. These agents sent messages to Germany that they knew were false. They helped deceive the country they had originally wanted to serve. Some did so out of conviction, having genuinely switched loyalties. Others did so purely out of fear and survival instinct. The British intelligence officers who ran the double-cross system also carried burdens. They were responsible for the psychological destruction of enemy intelligence officers who were, in many cases, just professionals doing their jobs. The operations they conducted were necessary for winning the war, but they weren't without moral complexity. German intelligence analysts who realized they'd been deceived experienced professional devastation. Imagine spending months on careful analysis, certifying intelligence as reliable, writing assessments that reach the highest levels of military leadership, and then discovering it was all based on sources controlled by the enemy. Some of these analysts faced consequences. They were interrogated about how they'd been fooled. Some were reassigned to less important positions. Others fell under suspicion of being traitors themselves, even when they'd simply been victims of a sophisticated deception. Admiral Canaris himself would eventually face execution, though this was primarily due to his suspected involvement in anti-Hitler activities rather than intelligence failures. But the broader failure of the Abwehr during this period contributed to the climate of suspicion that engulfed the organization. The human cost extended to decisions made based on faulty intelligence, German forces positioned in the wrong places, resources allocated based on false assessments, operations planned around inaccurate understanding of Allied capabilities and intentions. Soldiers died because their commanders were operating with an intelligence picture that had been carefully crafted by the enemy. The operational failures that resulted from intelligence failures had real human consequences in terms of lives lost and suffering inflicted. The broader intelligence war. The psychological operations in 1943 were part of a broader intelligence war that spanned the entire conflict. The double-cross system was one element of a comprehensive British intelligence effort that included signals intelligence, code breaking, physical surveillance, and traditional espionage. The famous work at Bletchley Park, where British code breakers decrypted German communications encrypted with Enigma machines, provided crucial information about German military operations, but it also provided insights into German intelligence activities. British intelligence could read German messages about their own spy networks. They could see what intelligence German handlers were receiving from agents. They could observe how German analysts were interpreting information. This visibility allowed them to craft deceptions that would be maximally effective. The Americans, after entering the war, contributed their own intelligence capabilities. The FBI worked closely with British intelligence on operations in the Western Hemisphere. The OSS, the precursor to the CIA, conducted operations in Europe and shared intelligence with British services. Soviet intelligence was also active, though the relationship with Western allies was complicated by mutual suspicion. Nevertheless, all three major Allied powers benefited from the chaos and confusion created within German intelligence services. The Germans weren't entirely helpless. They had their own successes, including intelligence operations against Soviet forces and against resistance movements in occupied territories. But in the crucial theater of Britain and the planned invasion of Western Europe, they were comprehensively outmatched. Part of the German disadvantage was structural. The Nazi regime's paranoia and internal competition created multiple competing intelligence services that often withheld information from each other. The Abwehr, the SD, and other organizations frequently worked at cross purposes. British intelligence, by contrast, had achieved a high degree of coordination by 1943. MI5, MI6, and military intelligence worked together effectively. The 20 Committee provided centralized management of double-agent operations. Information flowed between organizations relatively smoothly. This structural advantage magnified the impact of operations like Mirror. The Germans couldn't effectively respond because their own organizational dysfunction prevented coordinated counterintelligence efforts. The technical aspects. The success of the double-cross system relied heavily on technical capabilities that the Germans didn't fully appreciate. Radio communication was the primary method by which agents reported to their handlers. The Germans believed these communications were secure, especially when using supposedly secure codes. What they didn't realize was that British intelligence had extensive capabilities for intercepting and analyzing radio traffic. British radio direction finding equipment could locate the source of transmissions. When a supposed German agent transmitted from Britain, British intelligence knew exactly where that transmission originated. This allowed them to ensure that transmissions came from the locations where agents were supposed to be operating. The British also had sophisticated equipment for analyzing the characteristics of radio transmissions. Each operator has a distinctive fist, a pattern in how they send Morse code. British intelligence made sure that when a turned agent transmitted, the fist matched what German handlers expected. Code-breaking capabilities were crucial. The Germans used various codes and ciphers for agent communications. British intelligence had to break these codes to understand what messages said, and then use the codes themselves when sending false messages. The success in breaking codes wasn't just about the specific ciphers used for agent communication. The broader success against Enigma meant that British intelligence could sometimes read German intelligence communications about their own agents, providing insight into what German handlers believed and expected. Photography and document forgery were essential skills. When agents needed to provide documentary evidence of what they were reporting, British intelligence had to create convincing forgeries. Identity documents, military orders, maps, photographs, all had to be produced to exacting standards. The British established sophisticated workshops where expert forgers created documents that would pass German scrutiny. They studied German paper, ink, typefaces, and bureaucratic procedures to ensure perfect authenticity. Even small details mattered. The way documents were folded, the wear patterns on papers that had supposedly been carried in pockets, the types of stains or marks that would naturally appear, all of these had to be carefully considered. The strategic impact. The destruction of German intelligence confidence in 1943 had strategic impacts that extended well beyond individual operations. As Germany faced increasing pressure on multiple fronts, accurate intelligence became more critical. The ability to anticipate enemy moves, to position forces effectively, to allocate limited resources where they would be most valuable, all of this depended on good intelligence. By undermining German confidence in their intelligence capabilities, British operations didn't just conceal specific Allied plans. They made German strategic planning much more difficult across the board. German military leaders had to make decisions with greater uncertainty. They couldn't be confident about Allied strength, capabilities, or intentions. This uncertainty led to defensive strategies, hedging of resources, and inability to concentrate forces effectively. The psychological impact affected not just intelligence professionals but military leadership more broadly. Field commanders learned not to trust intelligence assessments. They became skeptical of information from higher headquarters. This breakdown in trust made coordinated operations more difficult. The strategic impact was particularly significant regarding the anticipated Allied invasion of Western Europe. German leadership knew an invasion was coming. That was obvious, but they couldn't determine where, when, or in what strength. Intelligence was so compromised that even when they received accurate information, they couldn't distinguish it from the mass of deceptive information. This uncertainty persisted right up to the D-Day landings in June 1944. Even after the invasion began, German leadership was uncertain whether Normandy was the main landing or a diversion preceding a larger landing elsewhere. This uncertainty, carefully cultivated through intelligence operations over many months, prevented them from committing reserves effectively during the crucial early days of the invasion. The strategic paralysis created by intelligence failures contributed significantly to Allied success in the final years of the war. While military operations and material superiority were obviously crucial, The intelligence dimension provided a force multiplier that made Allied advantages even more decisive. The post-war realization. The full extent of the double-cross system and operations like Mirror weren't revealed until after the war ended. As Allied forces captured German intelligence archives and interrogated German intelligence officers, the story began to emerge. German intelligence professionals learned just how comprehensively they'd been deceived. The scope of British penetration of their networks was staggering. Agents they'd trusted completely had been working for the enemy for years. Intelligence they'd based crucial decisions on had been carefully crafted deception. The psychological impact of these post-war revelations was significant. Former German intelligence officers had to confront the magnitude of their failure. Some had suspected penetration during the war, but hadn't realized the full extent. Others had remained confident in their methods and sources until confronted with documentary evidence of how they'd been fooled. These revelations had to be humbling and devastating. These were professionals who'd spent their careers developing expertise in intelligence work, and they'd been completely outmaneuvered by their British counterparts. For the British officers who'd run the double-cross system, the post-war period brought recognition of their achievements. Books were eventually written, honors were awarded, and the operations became case studies in successful intelligence work. But there were also complexities and controversies. Some questioned whether certain deception operations had been necessary or ethical. Others debated whether the same resources devoted to intelligence deception might have been better used in other ways. The historical assessment has generally been very positive. The double-cross system is considered one of the most successful intelligence operations in history. The psychological destruction of German intelligence confidence is seen as a significant contribution to Allied victory. But the human stories remain sobering. The agents caught between sides. The intelligence officers on both sides working in a shadowy world of deception and counter-deception. The soldiers whose fates were affected by decisions made based on false intelligence. The lasting lessons. Operation Mirror and the broader double-cross system left lasting legacies in intelligence practice. The concept of running double agents became a standard element of intelligence operations. Every major intelligence service now assumes that some of their agents might be compromised and works to identify and manage that risk. The psychological dimension of intelligence work received more attention. It's not enough to collect information or even to conduct successful operations. The psychological impact on the enemy's intelligence capabilities is itself a valuable objective. The importance of counterintelligence was reinforced. Protecting your own operations from enemy intelligence is at least as important as conducting intelligence operations against the enemy. The Germans failed catastrophically at counterintelligence in Britain, and that failure had cascading consequences. The integration of different intelligence sources became standard practice. The British success relied on combining human intelligence from double agents with signals intelligence from code breaking and other technical intelligence sources. Modern intelligence operations routinely integrate multiple sources in similar ways. The use of intelligence for deception purposes, not just for information gathering, became more sophisticated. The idea that you could control the intelligence picture the enemy receives and use that control to manipulate their decisions became a core element of intelligence strategy. The importance of organizational structure and coordination was demonstrated. The British advantage wasn't just in individual capabilities, but in how effectively their intelligence organizations work together. Modern intelligence communities pay close attention to coordination and integration across different agencies. Perhaps most fundamentally, the operations demonstrated that in intelligence work, the human factor is paramount. Technical capabilities matter, but ultimately intelligence is about human judgment, human psychology, and human organizations. The Germans had competent analysts and reasonable technical capabilities, but they were defeated by a combination of British organizational superiority and psychological operations that exploited human tendencies toward confirmation bias and trust in established sources. Conclusion: by the end of 1943, German intelligence had been psychologically shattered. The professionals who had believed they were conducting effective intelligence operations discovered they'd been comprehensively deceived. The networks they'd trusted were largely controlled by the enemy. The intelligence they'd relied on was carefully crafted deception. Operation Mirror and similar operations weren't just about hiding specific military plans. They were about destroying the enemy's confidence in their own capabilities. They were about creating a state of paralyzing uncertainty that would persist through the crucial final years of the war. The German spies didn't lose hope because they were defeated in a single operation. They lost hope because they realized the entire game had been rigged against them for far longer than they'd imagined. Every success they thought they'd achieved might have been an enemy deception. Every decision they'd influenced might have been exactly what the enemy wanted. That realization, that comprehensive loss of confidence and trust, was more devastating than any physical defeat. You can recover from losing a battle. Recovering from losing faith in your own judgment, your own methods, your own profession, is far more difficult. The British and Americans achieved something in the intelligence war that had profound impacts far beyond the secret world of spies and codes. They convinced their enemy that nothing could be trusted, that reality itself might be a carefully constructed deception. In doing so, they turned German intelligence from an asset into a liability for German military operations. Commanders learned not to trust intelligence assessments. Resources were wasted chasing phantom threats. Real Allied operations proceeded with less German scrutiny because the Germans couldn't distinguish genuine intelligence from deception. The story of 1943 and the bizarre mission that made German spies lose all hope is ultimately a story about the power of comprehensive deception. It's about what happens when one side controls the information environment so completely that the other side can no longer trust anything, including their own judgment. It's a story with lessons that remain relevant today, in an age where information warfare and psychological operations have become even more sophisticated. The fundamental insight remains: control the information your enemy receives, and you can control their decisions. Destroy their confidence in their own capabilities, and you've defeated them more thoroughly than any battlefield victory could achieve. The German spies lost hope not because they were captured or killed, but because they realized they'd been living in a false reality created by their enemy. That's a defeat from which there's no recovery, and that's why the bizarre mission of 1943 remains one of the most significant intelligence operations in history.